This is Becoming Inclusive from the Kaleidoscope Group, where we're thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion for more empowered people at work. We're committed to real change, and that begins with real conversations. Welcome in.
I'm Reggie Ponder, and welcome to another episode of Becoming Inclusive. I'm your co-host, and if you missed us, we are back. We have my co-host, Catherine Potts. Hey, Kat, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I know you did some vacationing and had some fun, so it's good to have you back. And we have been able to wrangle. I mean, we got. I don't even know how you did this, Kat, but you were able to get Sarah Black to join us for this podcast, and I am so excited for having her. She is the global communications consultant. She works on our global practice. She is not in the States at this moment, but she's figured out how to spend some time with us to talk to us about. Hi, Sarah, how are you?
Hey, Reggie. Hi, Kat. I'm good. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we talk a lot about so many different issues, but Kat, one of the things you and I talk about all the time is how do companies respond to all the things that are happening in our universe? Because when there's a crisis, and it doesn't matter what community it hits, if it's the LGBTQ community, if it's the African American community, Latino community, it really doesn't matter. That the information is out there and everybody's out there waiting for what is that company going to say? What is that company going to do? Are they going to respond? Well, how come they haven't said anything to that? And I know you and I talk about this all the time.
Yeah, we do. I mean, there's just access to information everywhere now. There's no way to get around knowing about things that are out there, knowing about things that are important. And then there's the pressure of how do we respond?
Yeah.
And Sarah, and that's why I'm really glad to have you here, because we could talk about this from a U.S. perspective, but the fact that you look at this from a global perspective, you know that there are nuances and ways in which companies have to look at this differently in different markets. And you've come up with some thoughts on this whole issue of what companies should do. And I'd like to just let you jump in here.
Thanks, Reggie. And you're right, there is a lot of pressure, right? It's, the news cycle is 24/7, it's in our faces. Not only that, but there's some research that says that both employees and the community as a whole are increasingly looking to employers and to businesses and organizations for information, perspective, guidance. So there's a lot of pressure on business leaders. There's a lot of pressure on my fellow communications professionals in those businesses to respond to everything. And the sad fact is that we could respond every single day. I mean, that's the awful truth of the situation that we're in right now in the world. One of the things that I worked on with my colleague, Don Bryan, who is our Senior Vice President of the Global Practice, and one of the things that we're passionate about is saying to organizations, don't wait until the phone is ringing and the headlines are breaking. Put together a framework so that you can actually go, okay, when do we respond? Okay, we have a process for thinking about these things. It's not foolproof, but we really strongly advise you to think and be intentional about your responding, particularly if you're committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, right, which we hope you are. Then think about intentionally some of the processes. And we've come up with 3 C's. Reggie, I know you gave me a 4th, so I'm going to bring that in. But the first one is about culture. So what is your business about? What are your business values? What's your business strategy? Is this an issue that fits with all of those things? Is it part of who you are as an organization? Are you being authentic if you comment on something? And do you have action to back it up? Right?
And so when you bring this whole thing up about culture, there is this thought, and I've asked almost maybe everyone who's come on our podcast this whole thought of, we're here to do the work. Why are we dealing with this?
This is Reggie's favorite point to bring up.
All I'm trying to do is make some widgets.
No.
And now we're dealing with this.
Yeah. And I think part of this is that this is about doing the work, that if we want to build more inclusive organizations and hopefully a more inclusive society, then sometimes we have to take a position on things, and we do have to comment, and we do have to use, as organizations, you have a huge amount of employers, you have a huge amount of power in the world, and there is a pressure to use that responsibly, and to use that in a way that has meaning. And one of the things I'm passionate about is, if you're going to talk about it, make sure you've got action to back it up. You know, don't do something on Black History Month, for example. It's Black History Month in the UK as we're recording this. And then not have any action. You know, as one of my friends is saying, thank you, Advita, for this, performance, not performative. You know, you've got to move from one to the other. The other thing I would say is that think about the culture of your organization, what your people are about, where your values are. But the other thing is around cause. Do you actually know what's going on? Do you really understand the issues? Have you really done the work to understand the issues? And have you talked to people? It's really easy to, you know, make a quick comment, but you can actually be doing more harm than good. Right. And have you listened to people who actually do know about the issue? And the third one is about community. How does this affect your stakeholders? Have you engaged with them? Have you talked to people within the organization and said, hey, if we say this, where's that going to leave you? And have you listened to people within your organization and aligned with them? And again, that comes to, if we say something that is going to negatively or positively impact the community in which we work. And the other one, Reggie, thank you for this one, that you gave me, we were talking off camera, is about care. Do you really care about this issue? Is there passion behind it? Or are you being tick box, we have to say something about this because everybody else is? Or does it really come from a place of, we passionately care about this issue and we're going to bring our voice to it? So those are some of the things to think about. You may have other things in your organization that you want to put in that framework, but I think it's really important to have something that you can look at and check that when an issue does come up in the world, you've done some thinking, you're like clear, this is where we sit, this is where we can comment, this is where it's not appropriate for us to comment. And also because if you comment on every single thing, it actually becomes a little bit meaningless. You know,
right. Responding.
Yeah, I think we've all had a little eye roll at some point on somebody going thoughts and prayers. I will say that's cultural, by the way. I will say there's places where thoughts and prayers are very much appreciated, but there's other places in the world, particularly sometimes in the States, where we want more than thoughts and prayers, we want some action. So you do also have to nuance that a little bit culturally.
And so
it sounds too like when you're getting to the bottom of cause, the cause can help you develop whether you care about it or not. Because if you don't fully understand something, it will be difficult to be able to develop how much you care about it, which then will make it difficult to get to a point of action. And I think being able to take the temperature of that will lead you down into and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like what is the best thing for our company once you're able to kind of extrapolate those two things together.
I think it's really important to understand what's going on. I think I did some reading and research on this recently. There have been occasions where companies have felt there was like I don't want to say a storm, but kind of a pressure that everybody was talking about an issue, and so they say something, they don't quite get it right, and there's a real risk in that because they haven't done the work to understand the issues. I think we've seen that in some of the anti-racism action, perhaps coming out of the States in the last couple of years. People haven't quite grasped, they haven't done the work internally, and so they may go out and say something and everybody goes, it didn't land quite the way you thought it would. But in lots of issues, you do have to understand really what's going on and what role you can play and where it's appropriate for you to sit. I think the more you understand the issue, the more excited you can get about it, the more you can care. And perhaps you realize where your voice can add the most value. So that it's not always a condemnation, it's not always a praise. It's actually finding a space where you have something meaningful to say and that resonates with your employees and with your stakeholders. I think one of the things, Reggie, that you talked on at the very beginning is there's also a risk management element to this, right? Sometimes there's a risk to not saying anything and you look tone deaf or you look like you don't care, particularly if it strikes at the heart of what your business issues are, or the location in which you're based, or the way in which you operate. And then you still have to find the appropriate thing to say. There's also a risk in saying something and there being a gap between what you say and what you do. People in the UK will have seen this perhaps on Twitter around International Women's Day. And whether you saw it so much in the US, but we saw it a lot in the UK. Two very smart women, I think it was, created a little Twitter bot. And every time somebody tweeted about International Women's Day, this bot automatically retweeted it, telling everybody what the gender pay gap was in that organization. Now, some organizations came out great because there was a minimal or no pay gap. Some organizations didn't come out of it so well. And it's because they were talking about an issue, but they hadn't looked at what was happening in their own organization and kind of balanced those two things. There may have been very good reasons for the pay gap being where it was. I can't think what they would be. There may have been reasons, but they didn't get a chance to explain those because the bot was just out in front of it all the time. So really, really interesting what happens. People are so tuned into what they feel is performative action or performative comment now from businesses. So you really do need to have that deep work on the cause and the understandings. I will say there are some occasions where something is so awful and so outrageous that it's not easy to condemn it, but you don't necessarily need to have a huge, huge depth to say that is awful, we're taking immediate action. If that impacts you, I think recently the war in Ukraine would have been an example of that, where you don't have to understand geopolitics to make a condemnation on that.
So you bring up a number of things, but I want to step back for a minute because I want to make sure that our listeners know those C's. So the first C is culture. The second C is cause. The third C is community. And then you were kind enough to throw in the fourth C, care. And when we look at culture, I want to just go back to culture just for a moment. Is that when we look at culture, I said to you, look, I just want to make my widgets. And you said that part of getting the work done is actually addressing these issues. And I think I just didn't want us to gloss over that because I think that that's such an important point. Can you expound on that just a bit?
Sure. I think it's whatever's happening in society walks in the door of your widget factory every day when your employees walk in the door, right? It comes right in with them. Whatever's happening in the world, they bring it in with them. It's part of who they are. It's part of their lives. So they're going to look to you for your position as a leader. They're going to look to the organization. What do we believe in? What's this about? What do we care about? Those are all things that people perhaps increasingly are looking at. They want to be able to trust their employer. There was some data, and I'll try and find it for anybody who's watching. I'll put it in the notes, the comments, that sort of through the pandemic and post and in the society that we're in now, increasingly the most trusted institution are businesses, not government, not the media, are employers. And so you may want to make your widgets, but you also want to know, well, what do I do about this? Or what's happening with this? Do we care about that? Particularly if that issue impacts you, you may want to know that your employer really cares about it. And so thinking about things like values, and thinking particularly as we do, obviously at Kaleidoscope with the DEI lens, if we want to build an inclusive workplace for the people who are making the widgets, then knowing where we stand on some issues or making a comment when we feel we're perhaps advocating on behalf of our employees, on behalf of our communities, can be really powerful. So that's why I think it's part of it.
Yeah, and really quick, I want to make the connection between culture and like retention, employee retention, because if you're onboarding employees and you're telling them this is what we stand for, this is what we believe, X, Y, and Z, and then you're just in this more performative space, you're going to end up having a revolving door on some level because people these days, especially employees, are buying into culture. They are buying into culture. They want to go into a company that they aligns with who they are at their core beyond any sort of level of professionalism.
Yeah, and there's some data, I think it's from Edelman, that talks about what people are looking for in a job, and part of it is the values and this having a position on diversity, equity, inclusion, being committed to some of these things. There's a lot, there really is a lot of expectation around our business leaders these days, and that's part of what I would say, get a framework, be intentional, so that when the kind of virtual equivalent of a microphone being stuck under your nose happens, you can think about why should I speak on this? Why should I not speak on this? Position.
And you and I talked about this too offline, about this whole thing about money in the bank. Is that when companies have a reputation for doing quote unquote the right thing or being caring, when they make a slip up from a cultural perspective, people are more willing to say, I don't like what you did, but I've seen you do it better. I've seen you in better days. So I won't give you a pass, but I'm surely not going to condemn you in the way that I might, because I do have some sense of your intentions.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that's very true, Reggie. And I think nobody gets it right all the time, right? That's something we say all the time when we're working with our clients. We're all going to slip up sometimes. Best of intentions. I think that's very true. And I think that thoughtfulness and intention, I keep coming back to that, is part of getting that money in the bank. I think it's also how you handle the mistake. Sometimes your mistake is the social issue, right? And we're all going to make mistakes. It comes back to how you as an organization handle those and how you also address those when they happen. And thinking about those 4 C's, and also thinking about, sometimes my 5th C is consequences. Thinking about those together when things maybe don't go the way that you'd hope, when your impact doesn't match your intent, and having the courage to say, do you know what, we got that wrong. We're going to learn. We're going to do better. But actually do then make sure that you do the learning, and that you do come back and you do better in the future. And I have a lot of respect for organizations that do that, because I think there's a lot of transparency and a lot of integrity there. And also, like I said, courage in being able to say, oh, we were really trying. That didn't go great. People have talked to us. We're walking it back.
I love that. So if we move to the second one again, which is cause, I like what you talk about in terms of understanding the cause that we are talking about. Kat brings up this whole thing about retention, and you gave that really great example of women pay equality, and even if they didn't do that bot, the people in the organization will mess it up for you, because what'll happen is that they'll be like, no, that's not right. I know they're not paying right.
Yeah, it comes back to that performative thing and really understanding the issues and reading the room a little bit. Like, what's the temperature on this? What are people saying about this? What is the community most affected by this culture, this issue, saying about it? What are and also thinking through the steps, particularly if you're concerned about diversity and inclusion. Is there an equity issue around this issue, whatever it may be? And learning about it and taking some time to sort of, there's a temptation to knee-jerk, right? And immediately step out and say something, right? And we're all, I think, prone to that pressure at some point in our lives. But I think when you have this power and responsibility as an employer or a major organization or society, you have to think a little bit more carefully and really get in and understand what people's experiences are about, what the issue is about, whether you're making an informed comment. If something's breaking news, have you actually got the facts of what's happening? Because you can comment too soon and then discover that you've actually got the facts wrong.
You talked about this, like coming back to the communications people with a CEO and having said something earlier in the day, and they said, "Did you know that your CEO just said such and such?"
And you're like, "Oh, really?" Yeah, that's always an anxiety in the moment, isn't it? But again, that's why it's important to have these conversations in advance. And to have the conversations openly as a leadership team and say, okay, there's some things we're passionate about. Is it appropriate for us to speak on them? Maybe. It just depends. There's so many factors in that. But I think it does come back to knowing what you're talking about. And also, me as an individual having a view, that's one thing. Me speaking on behalf of an organization with its power, its influence, its responsibilities, that's a different thing. And so you do sometimes have to navigate that space between personal passion and what's appropriate for your brand or your organization to say in the environment. And also having that alignment between your personal integrity and your organizational integrity. If you're a leader, you need to try and align those two things as well, obviously. But yeah, the in-depth knowledge and doing the work on the issue or the cause, whatever it happens to be. And sometimes you do have to do that really quickly because these things happen quickly and there's a moment. And sometimes you need a holding statement where you can say, we're very concerned about this. We want to make sure that we understand it before we really rush into saying or doing anything more. again, I have a lot of respect for that because it shows you're taking it seriously. It shows you're being thoughtful, and it shows you're not going to rush to say something that could actually be detrimental, not just to your organization's reputation, but to impact your relationship with your employees, your relationship with the wider community. And so being respectful of those things and respectful of the cause so that you do actually know what you're talking about, you don't make it any worse, and you hopefully make things better.
I think there's also something to be said about if you're taking the opportunity, if your company isn't doing what you want to be doing, to actually vocalizing that as well. We're not here yet, but we're a part of the cause to get to, from A to B. Being able to say that is also the option. If you aren't walking the walk, you can say that we're trying to, and we recognize this, and we're trying to be better. Everyone join us. So there's opportunity there where you're not necessarily doing it, but you want to still be able to acknowledge that. And I think that'll also be inspiring for companies and businesses that are in that same boat and don't want to say something because they're not actively doing it, even though they are actively trying to figure out how to do it. It doesn't mean you have to be paralyzed, but then in your messaging, of course, like you've been saying, Sarah, you have to be intentional and strategic that your messaging is clearly saying that you're not pretending that you're something that you're not, but you're also acknowledging where your faults are while trying to, build awareness for what you're supporting.
Yeah. I've talked about this in other things that I've written with the Kaleidoscope, talking about the say-do gap. If you're going to have an awareness month, then don't go out, saying how fabulous you are if you know that the experience of your employees within the organization is perhaps not quite there yet. By all means, go out and talk about it and say, we're committed to doing better and we're trying, and here's 6 of the things we're doing to try and be better. But yeah, getting that gap so that you're authentic about who you are and where you are on the journey, I think is what most people really appreciate and want. They don't want to hear all about your achievements. They want the real story of where you are and who you are. And I think that's what employees resonate with as well. So yeah, from a retention and a recruitment point of view, that's also really important.
And so that's a really great segue, because when you start talking about a retention point of view, we're really talking about part of the community. There's the community that works for you, but there's also that community that you service, that your products and services. And I like that you bring in those factors, because it really makes a lot of sense when we're talking to a global person who looks at these, because those communities look different and the dynamics are different everywhere you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And so knowing your community, being really clear about who are you serving, just like profiling them. What does our community look like in Asia? What does our community look like in Singapore? What does our community look like in Scotland, where I am? What does that look like versus serving a community in the States? So different demographics, different identities, all kinds of differences impact how you respond and how you think about and how you address issues. Just being culturally sensitive around some of the things you might talk about. And so thinking about where you operate in the world and where your community is might impact all kinds of ways in which you respond to issues. But one of the things that, I'm just going to be a little bit controversial for a minute, perhaps, if that's okay. But one of the things that came up for a lot of people is, quite rightly, there were a lot. War in Ukraine has displaced, I think, the world's biggest ever population of refugees. It's alleged to be. But for a lot of people in different parts of the world, there was a huge response to the business community towards those refugees that hadn't been from other countries. And so there's a lot of tension in that. So it's thinking about, where do we operate? Where's our community? Have we had equity in opportunity that we've created for all refugees? So thinking about those things globally, thinking about beyond the immediate and pressing need, trying to think strategically about the issues, particularly if you are concerned about building a more inclusive society or a more inclusive business. So thinking very broadly about those issues and thinking, if we respond to this issue in this part of the world, well, what are we doing about a similar issue in another part of the world? Have we ignored that because our head office is in this place and we only employ 10 people over here? So thinking about those things and how you weigh the balance of that is really important if you're operating globally.
And that brings to mind for me what happened with the passing of the Queen, is that in some places it was the worst thing to happen in life. But in other places, the response to that was totally different. And it was really interesting to look at that around the world. So I love the fact that this community piece is that you do need to know who you're serving, who's your audience, and I like that. So then I want to move to this care.
Yes.
I'm doing care because I think what happens is that you can really feel when people are authentic, when they really care about the issue. I think Kat brings up such a great point, is that when you can even say, hey, I'm not there yet, but you know something? This is important to me. This is important to my company. We are working on it, and we actually have set some goals toward that.
Yeah.
To me, that's all about showing me that you really care about this issue.
Internally and externally, because
Absolutely.
it might be externally, of course, but like internally, sometimes depending on how large your company, like at KG, we're a relatively small company, but if you're at a company with say 3,000 people, and depending how internal communications are, you may have no idea that your company's working towards anything. You really might not. It might be the first time you might learn is because, the company posted on Twitter about it saying that they're working towards X, Y, and Z. So you have to be cognizant, I think, of that too. And I would even venture to say maybe you let people know internally that you are working on it and then make it public.
And that's a great point, Kat, and I absolutely agree. And I think you probably heard me say this before because we talk quite a lot. Your insides and your outsides need to match.
Yeah.
Is something I say a lot. So your employees should always know first. And even if you are responding to an issue that has, come up in society that you have never really had to think about before, you've never been confronted with it before, it's an absolute crisis, right? And one of the things about crises is that we don't always get to predict them. You should always check in with your employees. I'm a great believer that if something's happening, your employees should not hear about it on the 9 o'clock news. Or any kind of news bulletin on social media. They should hear about it from you. Even if it's only 20 minutes before they're going to see it on Twitter, they should hear about it from you. You should know who your audiences are. You should treat them with respect. And also think about how you're going to get the news out. So if your employees are hearing about it because you suddenly commented on a social issue publicly and they're like, oh, nobody's talking about that in here, that's a problem. That's a real alignment issue for me. In an ideal world, your employees will know about it. They will almost be able to predict how you will respond because that's how strong your culture will be and how strong your communications will be internally. They will go, this organization is going to do the right thing. They're going to say this. They're going to speak. They're going to step forward. You would hope there would be no surprises. And again, that's where you want to avoid the say-do gap, where we say one thing, but we're doing something else internally or we're doing nothing internally or as a business. So if you're going to speak out on environmental stuff, make sure that you have your supply chain right, that you have recycling opportunities, that you're educating your staff. Everybody's got an opportunity to participate and give their opinion on that everybody's involved in problem solving, all of those sorts of things. I think it's really important that employees recognize your voice when you speak externally because they've heard it internally before. And that it's not the first time they've ever heard their chief executive speak also is good. So
I want to wrap it up with your 5th C, and that's consequences. I am so glad that you threw in consequences. There's a thing here for me, Sarah, about that you shouldn't do things because you're scared of the consequences. You should do things based on that 4th C, that care, or on all the other 3, on culture, on understanding the cause, on the community, and on care, not because you're scared about the consequences. However, you do need to recognize that there are consequences, and I love that you brought that up. So can you speak to that for a bit?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a risk sometimes in saying nothing. If it's an issue that really is pertinent to your business or that is happening that immediately impacts your community, particularly your employees, and you have suddenly we have nothing to say. There can be a risk in that. There can be a risk in silence. And there are consequences of that in terms of how people view your brand, engage with you, want to work with you, don't want to work with you, all of those things. There is consequences to misstepping and getting it wrong, particularly if you've not thought about the issue ever before. But But there are also positive consequences in stepping out and having a position, provided you've done the work and you've thought it through. And those can be positive in terms of your relationship with your employees, your relationship with your stakeholders, your brand reputation. As you said, Reggie, reputational money in the bank is very valuable. And so there are consequences, and it is important to make sure you have thought through those consequences. And sometimes the consequences will mean that you need to take more action. You need to do more than issue a statement. You might need to shift some policies. You might need to invest in a different area. You may need to put some effort and energy behind something. You may need to learn. You may need to do education. So it's really thinking through the consequences. If we speak, what does that mean? And do we have action strategy behind it? Where does it go from here? So being mindful that, again, the knee-jerk thing, it's very easy to say something quickly in the heat of the moment or under a lot of pressure. But do be aware that that will have consequences for your business, both positively and negatively potentially.
Kat, before we close, I think I'll give you the last word here.
No, I'm just thinking about the consequences and so there's consequences and there's like perceived consequences, right? Like, which are very simple, they kind of are the same thing, but it's like, these are the real things we could face. And then this is what I'm feeling like, because personally, I feel uneasy about it. And I think it's important to take time to be able to compartmentalize those two things, because if not, I feel like you could get lost in the minutia and then you don't move anywhere, because it's like, is this a consequence because I'm really scared about how I feel about it personally, how it's going to look for me, and if I'm the CEO? Or am I scared because of what it could do to the cash flow of my company, my business, or my customers? So I think really taking time too, so that you're not driven by just like emotion and your own fear, but like being able to stay objective.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I'm an advocate for having a framework to make these decisions around, and talking about some of these things before you're in a situation where you feel that intense pressure. And it is a lot of pressure, and I do want to acknowledge that this is not easy for people, and it can be really difficult. And so the pre-work, the thinking about it, the having those conversations. And the last thing I want to say about consequences is, as we hope you are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, if you make a statement, if you have a position, does that advantage or disadvantage anybody? And thinking about that as well, so that you're bringing, hopefully, your commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion into this space too.
Wow. Well, let's recap for those of you who might have even just came in on the middle. We have 5 C's here. We have culture, cause, community, care, and consequence. And I'm gonna stay with the C's and saying that that's my co-chair, Catherine Potts, and that is our champion, Sarah Black. I'm Reggie Ponder. This is Becoming Inclusive. Thank you for joining us.
And don't forget to share, give us some feedback. All of it's really helpful to make sure that we are serving you the best way possible.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Becoming Inclusive is presented by the Kaleidoscope Group, your full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion partner serving clients worldwide. Learn more and continue the conversation at kgdiversity.com.